February 24th, 2022. The day Vladimir Putin thought would mark the rebirth of a Russian empire. Hundreds of tanks roared across Ukraine's border under the gray winter dawn, backed by more than 190,000 troops and 1,200 aircraft. The plan was audacious: decapitate Kyiv in 72 hours, force a surrender, and parade victory before the world could react. But history had other plans. Now it's 2025. Russia's three-day war has stretched beyond 1,350 days of exhaustion, blood, and ruin. Putin's army has burned through half its combat hardware, lost over 1 million soldiers, and drained an economy once powered by oil and gas into near collapse. And yet, Ukraine still stands. In the early dawn over the Black Sea, Ukrainian naval drones tear through the waves, slamming into Russian ships once thought untouchable. Over Moscow, nervous radar operators watch red alerts flicker. Ukrainian drones now strike hundreds of miles inside Russian territory. And on Russia's northern border, Ukrainian flags flutter on land that Moscow once claimed as its own. For the first time in modern history, Russia, the world's so-called second strongest army, finds itself cornered, outmaneuvered, and bleeding from within. How did a smaller, poorer country outthink a nuclear superpower? What hidden strategy turned desperation into dominance? Because in this war, Ukraine didn't just survive. It outplayed Putin at every turn. It's a story of deception, innovation, and defiance that reshaped the map of Europe and exposed the crumbling myth of Russian invincibility. And then, the unthinkable happened. When Russia invaded Ukraine, it wasn't just a military operation. It was a test of global resolve. Putin's belief was simple: the West was weak, NATO divided, and Ukraine unprepared. His generals followed a textbook plan, a lightning decapitation strike aimed at Kyiv, built on Soviet-era doctrines of shock and awe. They expected the Ukrainian government to crumble, the army to disband, and the population to surrender. But they forgot one thing. Ukraine knew that playbook better than anyone. For decades, Ukrainian officers had trained under the same Soviet military doctrine that Russia still used. They knew its weaknesses, its obsession with hierarchy, its slow command structure, and its reliance on intimidation over adaptation. From day one, that knowledge became Ukraine's secret weapon. As Russian paratroopers descended on Hostomel Airport, a key gateway to Kyiv, they found not an empty runway, but a death trap. Ukrainian gunners opened fire with Zu-23 anti-aircraft guns, portable missiles, and a radar system hardened with NATO assistance. Within hours, burning helicopters littered the tarmac. The airport, meant to be Russia's bridge into the capital, became its graveyard of ambition. That first battle revealed the central contrast of this war: old empire versus modern network. Russia operated like a machine from the past, centralized, rigid, and predictable. Ukraine fought like the future, decentralized, data-driven, and fast. By 2023, Western analysts noticed something extraordinary. Russia still had more tanks, planes, and missiles, but Ukraine had something more dangerous: adaptability. Engineers turned consumer drones into deadly precision weapons. Soldiers shared real-time coordinates via encrypted Starlink networks, and commanders empowered small units to make decisions instantly, bypassing the layers of Soviet-style bureaucracy that crippled Russian response time. Politically, Ukraine's fight transformed the West itself. NATO, once divided over budgets and missions, found new unity. Sweden and Finland joined the alliance. Germany rearmed for the first time in a generation. The United States, under President Donald Trump, linked NATO funding to results, forcing Europe to invest heavily in its defenses. And for Russia, the consequences were immediate. Sanctions bit deep, cutting oil revenues and isolating its economy. Western technology, once embedded in every Russian tank and missile, vanished. Factories that produced jet engines and precision electronics went silent. What began as a war to expand the empire now threatened to dismantle it from within. But the true turning point didn't come from the battlefield alone. It came from deception. In 2022, Ukraine pulled off one of the greatest ruses in modern warfare, setting the stage for an audacious counterattack that stunned the world and humiliated the Kremlin. By the summer of 2022, Russia seemed unstoppable. Its troops had captured the strategic city of Izium, home to rail lines feeding the entire northern front. Around 18,000 Russian soldiers were entrenched there, turning it into a fortress. The Kremlin's propagandists boasted that Ukraine's collapse was inevitable. But behind the front lines, Ukrainian commanders were crafting a trap that would change the war's trajectory forever. The deception began quietly. Throughout July and August, Ukrainian officials and even Western analysts echoed the same message. A massive counteroffensive was coming in the south near Kherson. Satellite images showed troop movements. Journalists reported on secret preparations. Russia swallowed the bait. Entire elite brigades were pulled from the northern sectors and rushed south to reinforce Kherson. Then, on September 6, 2022, Ukraine struck. But not in the south. In a perfectly timed operation, Ukrainian forces launched a lightning offensive in the Kharkiv region to the north. What followed was one of the fastest, most stunning advances in modern warfare. Troops surged forward at 4.6 miles per day, retaking 1,150 square miles of territory in just 6 days. Russian positions collapsed like dominoes. Ammunition depots exploded. Tanks were abandoned. Entire Russian formations, some 10,000 men, vanished in chaos, marking the first time since World War II that Moscow lost entire divisions in a single campaign. Videos of Ukrainian soldiers raising their flags over liberated towns flooded social media, while in Moscow, citizens celebrated the city's 875th anniversary, oblivious to the catastrophe unfolding at the front. The Kharkiv counteroffensive proved Ukraine's military genius. They could turn limited resources into overwhelming momentum through speed, deception, and timing. But Kyiv wasn't finished. In August 2024, Ukraine did the unthinkable. It invaded Russia itself. The operation, codenamed the Kursk incursion, saw Ukrainian forces cross the border and capture nearly 480 square miles of Russian territory. It was a bold, high-risk maneuver, but it shattered the illusion that Russian soil was untouchable. Putin's army was forced to divert 50,000 troops away from other fronts, delaying its own offensives for months. For the West, this was the moment of revelation. When Ukraine struck inside Russia and Moscow didn't resort to nuclear retaliation, NATO's hesitation finally broke. Within months, the first F-16 and Mirage 2000s arrived in Ukrainian skies. Long-range missile systems, once forbidden, were now cleared for strikes deep into Russian territory. Ukraine's confidence surged. By mid-2025, it launched Operation Spiderweb, a coordinated drone strike hitting 5 Russian air bases simultaneously, crippling nearly a third of Russia's strategic bomber fleet. For the first time, explosions lit up the skies above Moscow, Ryazan, and Kursk on the same night. The attack was pure 21st century warfare. Small FPV drones guided through mobile networks, their signals hidden within civilian data traffic. Russia's air defense couldn't react fast enough. The message was clear. No place in Russia was safe anymore. Meanwhile, a silent revolution was transforming Ukraine's defense industry. From a modest $1 billion sector in 2022, it ballooned to $35 billion by 2025. Garage workshops became mini-factories, feeding a vast, decentralized network of over 900 suppliers. Each innovation, a lighter drone frame, a longer-range battery, spread across the network within days. The Brave One platform became a digital brain linking these creators into one adaptive organism of war. Out of necessity, Ukraine had built the fastest military R&D system on Earth, and the results were devastating for Russia. By early 2025, 70 to 80% of Russian battlefield losses came from drones alone. Cheap, precise, and endlessly adaptable, the swarm had become Ukraine's new artillery. But as Ukraine's innovation soared, Russia began to bleed. Its ancient factories could no longer keep up, and its generals, trapped in old doctrines, watched the empire's might crumble piece by piece. By 2025, the war was no longer about front lines. It was about survival. Russia, once feared for its military might, was now collapsing under the weight of its own ambition. The Kremlin's losses were staggering. More than 23,000 pieces of equipment destroyed, damaged, or captured, according to open-source intelligence. Over half of Russia's pre-war tank fleet, roughly 12,000 machines, was gone. What remained were relics, T-62s from the Cold War, and even T-34s from World War II rolling out of storage, more for propaganda than for battle. Military analysts estimated that Russia's equipment reserves could be exhausted within 12 to 18 months unless production tripled. Yet its defense industry could manage only 250 T-90M tanks and 460 BMP-3 vehicles per year, less than half of what the army was losing. Every destroyed tank now costs Moscow not just steel, but reputation. Economically, the situation was dire. Defense spending consumed 40% of Russia's federal budget, an unsustainable burden. Oil and gas, once the empire's lifeblood, were drying up. Drone strikes on refineries wiped out 17% of refining capacity, sending production into freefall. The European Union's price cap forced Russian crude down to $48 a barrel. And even its allies, China and India, demanded steep 40% discounts. Revenue from energy exports, which once made up half the government's income, plunged by a third. With sanctions choking imports, the ruble became volatile and inflation pushed food prices to record highs. The IMF reported a contraction of nearly 5% in Russia's GDP for 2025, despite official denials. For the first time since the 1990s, the Kremlin had to cut military spending projections for 2026, an admission that the war economy was running out of oxygen. Meanwhile, the human toll was unsustainable. Western intelligence estimated 1.1 million Russian casualties since the invasion began. Daily losses had climbed from 300 soldiers per day in 2022 to 1,300 by early 2025. Even if only a fraction were accurate, the demographic impact was catastrophic. Russia's working-age male population had already been shrinking for decades. Now, the war accelerated that decline. Roughly 3% of the entire labor force was locked in combat duty, a 40% increase compared to 2020. Factories faced critical shortages of engineers and technicians. Defense industries lacked over 120,000 skilled workers. To fill the gaps, the Kremlin resorted to desperate measures, emptying prisons, recruiting foreign mercenaries, even deploying North Korean troops, whose presence sparked ridicule on social media. While Russia sank deeper into attrition, Ukraine turned scarcity into strategy. Every missile and drone strike on fuel depots, bridges, and supply hubs forced Moscow to spend exponentially more to sustain each mile of front. Analysts from Reuters, DW, and Defense News observed that by March 2025, Russia needed 5 times as many assaults to capture a single square kilometer of land compared to 6 months earlier. Putin's 3-day war had become a meat grinder, yielding barely 68 square miles per month, a pace so slow that Forbes calculated it would take 230 years to occupy all of Ukraine. At the same time, each of those meager gains cost Russia thousands of troops and millions of dollars. Inside Russia, cracks widened. Regional protests spread from Dagestan to Yakutsk as mothers of conscripts demanded accountability. The once loyal state media avoided casualty numbers altogether. Even within the elite, whispers of discontent grew louder. Western intelligence leaks suggested power struggles between the FSB, the Defense Ministry, and private military factions still loyal to the ghost of the Wagner Group. Ukraine's innovation cycle kept widening that gap. Its defense industry, now producing 1/3 of all weapons used on the battlefield, became a self-sustaining ecosystem. With NATO's logistical support and Western capital investment, Kyiv turned what was once an industrial relic into Europe's most agile weapons lab. But beyond the economics and numbers lay a deeper truth. This war was rewriting the playbook of modern conflict. Russia's brute force doctrine, massed artillery, heavy armor, centralized command, was being dismantled by a cheaper, faster, smarter opponent. Ukraine's decentralized model, powered by civilian tech and rapid communication, was proving that adaptability could defeat scale. Every day the war continued, Russia paid a higher price in resources, in manpower, and in morale. What had started as Putin's bid to restore glory now looked like the slow unraveling of an empire. And while the Kremlin tightened censorship, the world watched as a new kind of warfare emerged, one that would define the next century. As Russia's grip on Ukraine slipped, the shockwaves rippled far beyond the battlefield. What began as a regional war had redrawn the global balance of power. NATO, once questioned for its relevance, now stood more united and muscular than at any point since the Cold War. President Donald Trump's insistence on financial accountability pushed Europe to finally act on decades of defense promises. Germany announced it would raise military spending to 5% of GDP by 2035, with 30% of that budget earmarked for joint European defense infrastructure. In the Baltic and Arctic, the security map was transformed. Sweden and Finland's accession to NATO boxed Russia further into isolation. Kaliningrad, once a forward base of intimidation, now sat surrounded by NATO territory on all sides. In the Black Sea, Turkey expanded cooperation with the US Navy, while Romania and Bulgaria accelerated rearmament programs funded through joint NATO investment. This was no longer just about Ukraine's survival. It was about deterrence for an entire continent. The war had become a testing ground for every modern doctrine. Western experts compared it to a live laboratory for the future of warfare. Cheap drones defeated billion-dollar jets. Decentralized data networks outpaced entire military-industrial complexes. A $3,000 FPV drone could disable a $10 million tank. A cost ratio that turned the old calculus of war upside down. The Pentagon, recognizing this shift, began its own restructuring. A new Rapid Adaptation Command was formed to mimic Ukraine's decentralized battlefield innovation. In Brussels, NATO codified Ukraine's drone warfare model into joint doctrine, emphasizing swarming tactics, AI-assisted reconnaissance, and distributed command systems. The Ukraine war had rewritten not only the rules of combat, but the economics of it. Meanwhile, China was watching closely. Beijing strategists saw in Russia's failures a grim warning. Large autocratic systems crumble when speed and transparency are replaced by fear and rigidity. In early 2025, China quietly halted several joint military projects with Moscow, pivoting toward independent tech development. Still, Beijing saw opportunity amid Russia's desperation. It bought discounted oil and gas at 40% below market rates, while Chinese companies gained near total control of Russian rare earth exports. What looked like partnership was, in reality, economic colonization. In the Middle East, Iran's role as Russia's drone supplier brought mixed results. Tehran earned billions selling Shahed drones, but its technology was soon reverse-engineered by Ukrainian and Western experts, exposing vulnerabilities and diminishing its strategic leverage. Israel, alarmed by Iran's proliferation, conducted cyber operations targeting Iranian drone facilities. Operations reportedly coordinated with US intelligence. Even North Korea entered the picture, and not in the way Putin had hoped. Pyongyang soldiers, deployed to fill manpower shortages, became global symbols of Moscow's desperation. Reports of poor discipline and outdated weaponry fueled ridicule, not fear. South Korea responded by fast-tracking its own defense expansion, exporting artillery shells and precision munitions to NATO stockpiles supporting Ukraine. And then came the economic realignment. Western sanctions, initially dismissed as symbolic, had matured into structural isolation. Russia's SWIFT exclusion forced it into fragile trade routes with pariah states. The shadow fleet of oil tankers sailing under false flags became a metaphor for Putin's entire regime, directionless, sanctioned, and unsustainable. But perhaps the most profound impact was ideological. The war reshaped the global narrative of authoritarian power. For decades, Moscow projected itself as a model of strategic patience, the empire that outlasted sanctions, revolts, and Western pressure. Yet by 2025, that illusion had shattered. In its place emerged a different kind of strength, the collective resilience of democracies learning to cooperate at speed. Ukraine's victories sparked a quiet revolution within NATO's ranks. Eastern European nations, once junior partners, now set the tempo of alliance strategy. Poland emerged as Europe's new logistical hub, coordinating weapons flows from Spain to the Baltics. The US reactivated Cold War-era bases in Norway and Greenland, citing Arctic security against renewed Russian naval movements. In Washington, Trump's administration used Ukraine's success as proof that burden sharing could work. American factories saw defense orders surge, revitalizing domestic production. For the first time in decades, the United States profited strategically from a European conflict without deploying ground troops. But the story wasn't just about military alliances or economics. It was about time. Each month, Russia lost another step, another export partner, another ounce of credibility. Its soft power evaporated as even former allies, from Serbia to Kazakhstan, distanced themselves from the Kremlin. And through it all, Ukraine became the new symbol of strategic endurance. A country that transformed from near collapse into a case study for 21st century warfare. Analysts began calling it the Zelensky Doctrine, the idea that adaptability, transparency, and unity could outperform wealth, size, or intimidation. Yet, amid this newfound strength, a haunting question lingered across the West's capitals. If Russia is cornered, what happens next? Would a weakened empire lash out, or would it finally fracture under its own weight? By late 2025, the war had become more than a struggle for land. It was a struggle for truth, identity, and the future of modern power. What began as Putin's gamble to restore an empire had transformed into a slow-motion collapse of everything he built. The Russian president once promised his people a quick, glorious victory. Instead, he delivered economic ruin, international isolation, and the largest military humiliation since World War II. Ukraine, against all odds, did what no one thought possible. It not only survived, it evolved. From the ashes of 2022, it emerged as a prototype for 21st century warfare. Agile, connected, and relentless. Its commanders blended Silicon Valley-style innovation with battlefield discipline. Its engineers turned garages into drone factories. Its citizens turned endurance into strategy. The world's richest nations had armies filled with advanced jets and precision missiles. Yet it was Ukraine, a nation written off as too small to win, that exposed the myth of Russia's might. The consequences for the Kremlin are existential. Nearly 18% of Ukraine's territory remains under Russian occupation, much of it reduced to rubble that Moscow must now pay to maintain. Each day costs Russia an estimated $300 million in logistics, salaries, and reconstruction of destroyed equipment. With oil revenues collapsing, enlistment drying up, and sanctions tightening, the empire that once threatened the West can barely sustain itself. And yet, the endgame remains uncertain. Will Putin cling to power through fear and propaganda? Or will the cracks, from the Kremlin's inner circle to the streets of Rostov and Kazan, finally burst open? Some analysts believe a silent coup could emerge within the next year, replacing Putin with a military technocrat eager to negotiate peace. Others warn of a darker scenario, a cornered regime lashing out with cyber attacks or hybrid warfare against the West. Meanwhile, Ukraine stands at a crossroads of triumph and exhaustion. Its armies among the most experienced in Europe. Its drone warfare doctrine is now studied by NATO, but the human cost remains heavy. Millions of displaced citizens still wait to return home. Rebuilding cities like Mariupol and Bakhmut will take decades. And yet, Ukraine's determination burns undimmed. Every successful strike, every liberated town, every intercepted missile has become a statement. You can destroy our buildings, but not our will. The story of this war has become the story of resilience versus regression, innovation versus inertia, truth versus tyranny. It asks the world a question that echoes far beyond the trenches of the Donbass. If a small democracy can defy an empire through sheer ingenuity and courage, What excuse do larger nations have for surrendering their principles to fear? Will Russia learn from its failure or sink further into isolation and decay? Will the West remain united once the dust settles, or will the old fractures re-emerge? And perhaps most urgently, has this war already revealed the blueprint for the conflicts of the future, where technology, information, and speed will matter more than borders or size? Only time, and the next decisions made in Moscow, Kiev, and Washington will tell. But one truth is certain. Ukraine has changed the world's understanding of power forever. And for Vladimir Putin, the price of underestimating his smaller neighbor has become the costliest mistake in modern history. Thank you for watching. If you believe this war's lessons matter for the future of peace and global security, share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep analysis on global conflict and strategy.